Let's face a terrifying fact. Today, the world is sitting on a true arsenal of destruction. More than 13,000 nuclear bombs are scattered across different nations, stored in silos, submarines, and planes. What would happen if all these bombs were suddenly detonated at once? We may have thought of this as a science fiction doomsday scenario, but the real consequences would be far worse than any movie or book has ever described. First of all, it's important to understand the absolute destructive power of these weapons. We are talking about devices that can turn a city to dust in seconds. The Hiroshima explosion in 1945 was an immeasurable tragedy, but compared to modern nuclear warheads, that bomb seems almost modest. Today, the global nuclear arsenal has an estimated power between 3,000 and 6,000 megatons, meaning thousands of times more powerful than Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. But what does it mean to release that much energy all at once? To understand the impact, let's break the event down into parts. The explosion itself would be the first shock. Literally. When a nuclear bomb, or fission bomb as it's also known, is detonated, the first thing that happens is the release of a violent shockwave that sweeps everything around it. This is because it harnesses the energy released when a heavy atomic nucleus splits into two lighter nuclei. This process is called nuclear fission, and it can be triggered by firing a neutron at fissile material, such as uranium-235 or plutonium-239. The resulting fission produces more neutrons, which can cause a chain reaction that releases massive amounts of energy in a very short period of time. It would be a blast of wind so powerful that it would toss cars like toys and tear buildings apart as if they were made of paper. Now multiply that by thousands of simultaneous explosions, spread across strategic points around the globe. This series of explosions would cause instant destruction in densely populated areas. New York, Moscow, Beijing, Paris, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, entire cities would vanish in a fraction of a second. Buildings, people, animals, everything would be reduced to dust. The heat released by the bombs is also staggering, millions of degrees Celsius at the epicenter of the explosion, potentially rivaling or even surpassing the temperature of the sun's core. Most materials would melt or vaporize at this temperature. A firestorm would form instantly, with winds so strong and hot that they would feed the flames, burning everything in their path. Those who weren't annihilated by the shock wave or flames would die from the released radiation. Nuclear bombs produce lethal ionizing radiation that, within minutes, would cause burns, radiation poisoning, and eventually death. Exposure to this radiation isn't like getting a bad sunburn. It penetrates deep into tissues, destroys cells, and damages DNA. In the days and weeks that followed, even those who survived the initial explosions would suffer from acute radiation sickness. But that's just the beginning. The real global catastrophe comes next. The great tragedy of a global nuclear detonation isn't just in the explosions themselves, but in what happens afterward. When so many bombs are detonated simultaneously, the amount of dust, soot, and radioactive debris thrown into the atmosphere would be colossal. Thousands of square kilometers of burning cities would send clouds of smoke into the air, quickly reaching the stratosphere, a layer of the atmosphere where these particles could remain for years. The sun, our primary source of life, would begin to disappear from our view. The amount of dust in the atmosphere would be enough to block sunlight significantly. The result? A drastic drop in global temperatures, what's known as nuclear winter. Temperatures could plummet by several degrees Celsius in just a few weeks, which might not seem like much at first. But think about the impact that would have on our daily lives. Have you ever felt the effects of a harsh winter? Now, imagine that happening everywhere at once, and not just for a few months, but for years. In a nuclear winter scenario, temperatures could drop so much that entire crops would be wiped out. Tropical regions, which are usually responsible for a large portion of the world's food production, would become barren and dry. temperate regions would face unseasonal frosts and never-ending winters. In no time, global agriculture would collapse. You don't need to be a scientist to understand what happens when there isn't enough food for everyone. Starvation would become the new pandemic, and the surviving societies after the explosions would face wars over resources. Even areas not directly hit by nuclear blasts would suffer from the effects of nuclear winter. Nations that were once wealthy and prosperous, now in ruins, would be fighting over a potato or a piece of bread. This is what it would mean to live in a post-global nuclear explosion world. Beyond nuclear winter, there's another persistent problem: radiation. As mentioned earlier, the detonation of all nuclear bombs would release a brutal amount of ionizing radiation. But the problem wouldn't end with the explosion. The residual radiation, known as fallout, would continue to spread across the planet. The radioactive particles lifted into the atmosphere would fall back to Earth over weeks and months, contaminating the soil, water, and air. Have you ever heard of Chernobyl, the worst nuclear accident in history? When a reactor exploded in 1986, it released a significant amount of radiation over Europe. Decades later, the area around the plant remains uninhabitable. Now, multiply that by thousands. The radioactive fallout from all the nuclear bombs would be global and would make vast areas of the planet uninhabitable for centuries. Some scientists estimate that in such an extreme scenario, life on Earth could regress to a state similar to what existed after the last great mass extinction 66 million years ago, when the dinosaurs disappeared. To complete this nightmare scenario, we have the total collapse of human civilization. Everything we rely on in our daily lives: electricity, transportation, communication, processed food, medicine, sanitation systems, depends on a highly interconnected infrastructure that, in a global nuclear war scenario, would be destroyed. Without power, cities would plunge into chaos. The lack of communication would leave people isolated, unable to coordinate any kind of organized response. With transportation systems destroyed, food and medicine couldn't be distributed. As mentioned earlier, hunger would spread rapidly, and disease would soon follow. Human nature itself would descend into chaos. With survival on the line, people would do anything to secure food, water, and safety for themselves and their families. If any government were left, it would be powerless in the face of such an overwhelming crisis. We would be thrust back into a state of nature, a brutal fight for survival where only the strongest or luckiest would manage to stay alive. Faced with such a devastating scenario, the final question is, would humanity survive? If all nuclear bombs were detonated at once, life on Earth would experience a dramatic collapse, with mass extinctions and widespread destruction of ecosystems. However, more resilient forms of life, such as bacteria, insects, and possibly some human populations and other vertebrate animals in remote areas, might survive. Earth wouldn't become a completely sterile planet, but life, especially complex life, would be severely compromised. These numbers are only rough estimates and depend on many factors, such as bomb design, the type and amount of fuel used, the altitude and location of the detonation, and atmospheric conditions. But one thing is certain: this type of bomb is capable of causing immense destruction and suffering to humans and other living beings. That's why we should probably think twice before playing with fire. See you in the next video.